So I'm going to start with a standard called COAL from OASIS. I'm a co-chair of this standard, so it's declared. Essentially, this is a standard which gives a privacy by design approach to organising data about people. And it's useful, I think, because it gives us a way of exploring why the ecosystem approach is so useful. It has three core elements, and the first of these is about how it defines roles within the ecosystem, and that gives us transparency, both for all the different actors and for the individual. It defines interfaces, and that gives us our interoperability. And lastly, it defines data types, and this is essential for data portability. So when we pull these three things together, we can see within an ecosystem, that gives us a very good starting point to think about consent and the processing of personal data more generally. So we'll have a quick look in a little bit more detail at some of these. So within the COAL standard, there are a clear set of roles defined. So we'll stop a moment. Who's had a chance to look at the declaration, the My Data declaration? Put your hands up, please. Okay. Who signed it? It's a divisive question. Oh, that's a few, great. I see a few people haven't. So the reason I picked that up is that from the, you'll see in that document there is an operator. The operator within the COAL standard is very closely aligned to the operator within My Data. They're the the role that is responsible for managing the relationship with the individual. The service provider is responsible for specifying the purposes, and Mark will come back to that later on. Those two together represent the data controllers. They may be the same actor, they may be different actors, but they're under GDPR, they're the data controllers. The data engine in this context is responsible as a data processor, and within the COAL standard they are working predominantly with pseudonymized data. If you have a look at the interfaces, very quickly, basically data in, data out, ecosystem management, and also this point about managing devices. This is a standard which is set up to deal with IoT, but in this context, devices mean anything which is capable of publishing personal data. And that's a useful construct that we've found in our work, to understand that there are things out there that are capable of publishing personal data, and we need to understand what their role is within the ecosystem. Lastly, I want to talk about portability. There are a number of data types stored and used within the COAL standard, but I'm going to talk about two of them. Directly identifying personal data. So if you're used to working in a US or an ISO context, this would be PII. We don't use PII directly as a term within GDPR, and hence this term, but the equivalence is useful. And on the other side of that, we have the behavioural data. So this is the fast-changing stuff. So quite often we talk about the directly identifying personal information as the static personal data. So this is the stuff which is traditionally used in identity attribute space, and therefore the behavioural data becomes the dynamic personal data. This is the behavioural. This is the stuff that records what we do on our phones, in our interactions with the rest of the world. These are all things which have a defined start time and an end time. By clearly separating these two types, we allow ourselves the luxury of pseudonymization. And that is a very important thing to understand early when you're architecting consent, about how do you think about these things so that you can both minimize data and you can move towards some of the advantages that GDPR gives you when you're dealing with pseudonymized data. Now, within the COAL architecture, there's a very specific term used for behavioural data, and they're called atoms. So I'm going to describe to you a little bit about what an atom is, and that will lead me to consent. So, atoms are event-coded bits of data. They're very granular pieces of information that can code anything that we do in our everyday lives. I'm going to show you a little bit about how that happens. They're microstructured data, and in the little hex here you can see the fields which are contained in that piece of microstructured data. Microstructure is great, because what it does is it gives us the power of structured data that a regulator loves, because you know exactly where all your data is, but it also gives us the insight capability of unstructured data within a Hadoop database. So I can run this in a very loose Hadoop database, but with a single query I can be very confident that I've returned all the data from a single individual within that space. So within that, at the centre we've got who, we need to know who this data pertains to, when the event occurred, what the event was, where it occurred, the context of that event, very useful in thinking about consent, how we know about it, and then lastly, consent. So there are two ways that we can think about coding consent with this type of architecture. The first thing is that we can do is we can create consent atoms. So I've used the word semantic in the last slide, which I was told I wasn't allowed to do, but The reason is that within the COL standard there is a taxonomy of behaviours, a semantic hierarchical taxonomy, which allows us to code all types of human behaviour. There are about 5,000 in there. But included in that, and to give you an idea, that's anything from having a cup of tea, taking a walk, catching a bus, doing a presentation, whatever. So within those, we have fields that allow us to code consent and notice. So we can create consent atoms. We can create a record of a point in time when consent was given, revoked, when notice was displayed or notice was acknowledged. The other very useful thing that we can do, because within that atom itself there is a consent field, we can use another open standard, the Kantara consent receipt specification, to record the details of a specific consent interaction. And because every single atom has a consent field, that means I can code every single granular piece of data with the consent that applies to that data. So it's a very, very powerful concept in terms of auditing and control of data and transparency. So I've listed out a few of the fields here within the Kantara consent receipt standard where we have a deliberate crossover between these two open standards. It's around jurisdiction, the time of the consent, retention period, purpose, again purpose specification is very important, the policy URL, very important so we can track that back to that experience that Richard was talking about. The record ID is very specifically the detail of the signed ID for that consent receipt. So we can create signed and also encrypted fields within the space if that's important for what we want to do. And also any third-party service that helped us create that consent. So if you're using a third-party service to help manage your consent, you can record that within that space. So I've now got all this consent data. Fantastic. I found a way of coding it, I can add context to it, and importantly, that consent data sits alongside all my other data. I've acknowledged that it is just personal data, and I can manage it in the same way that I manage my personal data. So what can I do? If I take you back to the roles I described, one of the roles was a data engine. And that data engine is capable of absorbing that pseudonymous data. So if you've got a data engine structure that is capable of managing personal data to this standard, they can manage consent. There is no add-on required. There is processing that you have as a business to wrap around that, but in terms of the underlying technology, it becomes immediately available. And data engine can take all sorts of forms. A large organisation that wants to manage consent may want to use a centralised repository, and I know many businesses out there that are doing that kind of work. You can have a centralised repository. You may find that an individual will hold their data themselves, or that you want to use a personal data store type approach. There's nothing to say that you cannot duplicate records and use it both in a centralised repository and give people a record that they can hold themselves that you can then compare. And you can also obviously use a distributed ledger. Because you've got a defined packet, you can put that package as part of a distributed ledger process, and I know many people would be very interested in that. But because we're using a simple interoperable format, we can easily put it into all those different management systems. So to recap, I skipped on a bit. Right, so I've shown you the OASIS standard, and I've talked about why that's a good model for thinking about why the ecosystem approach is so important. I've talked about how we can use atoms to make sure that we are rendering consent as dynamic personal data in its own right. I've shown you about how we can use that classification of everyday living, that semantic taxonomy, to create consent atoms. And I've shown you how you can use the Kantara consent receipt to create atomic consent in an interoperable way. And lastly, I've talked about some of the management systems. So that gives you an overview of all the things that you can do now using open standards in the management of consent. And so I think it's a pretty good example, and a lot of this is progress over the last year since the last conference. So a really good example about the role of open standards in the consent space. Thank you.